Pick up anything heavy right now, a book, a mug, a water bottle, it doesn't matter what it is. Hold it in your hand and swing it at a table, go ahead. Just a light tap, nothing dramatic. Now notice something, notice how the force of that impact travels. It doesn't just stop at the point of contact, it runs up through your wrist, into your forearm, into your elbow, and settles somewhere in your shoulder as a dull, unpleasant echo. That's from one light tap. Now imagine swinging that same object for 8 hours straight, not tapping a table, but swinging as hard as your body will allow, again and again, without stopping, without a break, without anyone to trade off with when your arms give out. Imagine swinging it hard enough to cut through a living tree trunk, and a tree trunk does not want to be cut. It fights you every single inch of the way. Its grain closes around your blade. Like a hand gripping a knife, it bounces your strikes back at you. It absorbs your effort and gives almost nothing in return. And it simply refuses to fall. Multiply that by every tree you'd ever need to clear, just to make one small patch of open ground. Now multiply that again by every generation of people who lived and died before anyone found a better way to do it. Now take that same impossible task, and imagine doing it with a sharpened rock, held directly in your bare fist. No handle, no grip, nothing at all between your skin and the impact except your own knuckles and your own willpower for over 1,000,000 years. That was not a hypothetical, that was the only option available to anyone, anywhere, on the entire planet. Your ancestors held a sharp stone in their hand, and they hit things with it, over and over, until something gave way. Usually it was the stone that broke first, sometimes it was the tree, and occasionally, it was their own hand. And then, at some point in that long, dark stretch of prehistory, someone did something that sounds almost too simple to matter. They wrapped a piece of wood around a piece of rock, they tied it tight, and they swung it. And the world changed, not slowly, not in some abstract, philosophical sense that takes generations to notice. It changed concretely, physically, immediately. The forests fell, the fields appeared where the forests used to stand, the animals were butchered faster, the shelters were built stronger, the enemies, when it came to that, died quicker. Everything that followed traces back to that single moment. Every farm carved out of wilderness, every wooden ship that ever crossed an ocean, every log cabin built by hand, every civilization that fed itself from land that had once been forest and had to be cleared before a single seed could be planted. All of it traces back to a rock tied onto a stick. It might be the single most underestimated invention in human history. So how did we actually get there? How do you go from a stone gripped in a fist to an axe swinging in a hand? The story starts much earlier than you'd probably guess. And it doesn't start with us, it doesn't start with Homo sapiens at all. In 2011, a team led by Christopher Lepper at Rutgers University published a paper in the journal Nature that pushed the oldest known hand axes back to approximately 1.76 million years ago. They were found at a site called Kokosili, on the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. But calling these particular objects axes is honestly a little generous. What they actually were was something archaeologists call Acheulean hand axes, teardrop-shaped stones, flaked on both sides, roughly the size of your palm, and held directly in that palm. No handle, no binding, no composite engineering of any kind, just a single rock, shaped through patient, deliberate work into something that fit the human hand and could cut, scrape, chop, and dig. And here's the detail that tends to stop people cold once they actually sit with it. The creatures making these tools were not Homo sapiens, they were Homo erectus, a different hominin species entirely, with a brain roughly 2/3 the size of yours, who nonetheless walked upright, controlled fire, and somehow worked out that if you chip away at the edges of a stone in a careful, symmetrical pattern, you end up with a tool that can do almost anything you need it to do. Sit with what that actually means for a second. The axe, or at least its earliest ancestor, predates our own species by nearly 1.5 million years. Homo sapiens didn't show up until roughly 300,000 years ago. By that point, Acheulean hand axes were already 1.4 million years old. We didn't invent the hand axe. We inherited it. It was already sitting there, waiting for us, a fully formed piece of technology. When our species finally arrived on the scene, and the design was so good, so effective, that we simply kept using it, essentially unchanged, for hundreds of thousands of years more. When I say the design didn't change, I don't mean that loosely. I mean it barely changed at all, in any meaningful way. For an almost unbelievable stretch of time, the Acheulean hand axe tradition ran from roughly 1.76 million years ago all the way to about 100,000 years ago. That's 1.6 million years of essentially the same basic tool, the same teardrop shape, the same bifacial flaking technique, the same fundamental form, showing up again and again across huge stretches of the ancient world. In East Africa, in India, in Europe, in the Near East. Shanti Papu and colleagues published findings in the journal Science in 2011 showing hand axes at a site called Adirampakkam in southern India, dating back roughly 1.5 million years. This wasn't a local trend confined to one valley or one river system. The design crossed continents, it crossed species boundaries too. Homo erectus made it, Homo heidelbergensis made it later on. Early Homo sapiens, when we finally arrived, made it as well. For longer than most species managed to exist on this planet before going extinct, somebody, somewhere, was picking up a rock and shaping it into that exact same familiar form. Here's something else worth pausing on, because it's a genuinely strange footnote in the history of how we came to understand any of this. The person who first correctly identified these tools for what they actually were spent decades being ridiculed for it. Back in the 1830s and 1840s, a French customs official named Jacques Boucher de Perthes started finding hand axes in gravel beds near Abbeville. In northern France, he published his arguments in a book titled Antiquités Celtiques et Antediluviens in 1847, claiming these objects were deliberately made tools, crafted by ancient humans who had lived long before anyone thought humans existed. The scientific establishment of his day told him, quite confidently, that he was wrong. They said the stones were natural formations, shaped by chance and geology, nothing more. They said no humans could possibly have existed that far back in time. The timeline simply didn't allow for it. It took until 1859, the very same year Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, for two British geologists, Joseph Prestwich and John Evans, to finally travel to the sites themselves, examine the physical evidence firsthand, and confirm, publicly, that Boucher de Perthes had been right all along. The entire field of prehistoric archaeology, as a serious scientific discipline, was essentially born because one stubborn customs officer refused to stop picking up rocks that everyone around him insisted meant nothing. But here's the thing about those early Acheulean hand axes, the thing that eventually forced our ancestors to look for something better. They were held directly in the hand, and that was both their greatest strength and their fatal, built-in limitation. When you grip a sharp stone directly in your fist and swing it into a tree trunk, every single ounce of that impact force travels straight back into your palm, up through your wrist, into your joints. You physically cannot swing as hard as you might want to, because your own body is forced to absorb the shock of every strike. You cannot generate real leverage, because your arm is short, and your grip is limited to whatever your hand can physically hold onto. And the sharp edge of the stone digs into your own skin. Again and again, every single time you strike something with it. A hand axe, used this way, will chop through a branch without much trouble. It will butcher an animal carcass efficiently enough. It will dig a stubborn root out of the ground if you're patient. But it will not fell a large tree, not efficiently, not without slowly, steadily destroying your own hands in the process. For the axe to become the tool that would eventually reshape the entire world, someone had to solve a problem, and this problem sounds almost embarrassingly simple when you first hear it described, but it is actually one of the most cognitively demanding challenges early humans ever managed to work through. They had to figure out how to attach the stone to a handle. In archaeology, this process has a name, hafting, and once it was solved, it changed absolutely everything that came after it. Think, for a moment, about what hafting actually requires, because it is genuinely not as obvious or as simple as it might first appear. You need a stone head shaped specifically to sit securely in or firmly against a wooden handle. Not just any stone, not just any handle. The stone has to be exactly the right size, the right weight, the right overall shape. It needs a groove, or a notch, or at minimum a flat surface that will mate cleanly with the wood without slipping loose the moment real force is applied to it. A handle itself has its own set of demanding requirements. It has to be the right length to actually provide meaningful leverage. It has to be the right thickness to absorb shock without transmitting all of it straight back into your hand. And it has to be cut from the right kind of wood entirely, a wood that will flex slightly under stress instead of simply snapping the first time it's put under real pressure. And then, once you have the right stone and the right handle, you still have to actually join the two together, not with a nail, not with a bolt, not with glue squeezed out of a tube. The way we'd solve this problem today without a second thought. You need a genuine binding material, sinew from an animal, or twisted plant fiber, or strips of rawhide applied wet, which then shrinks tight as it slowly dries around the joint. And in many documented cases, you also need an actual adhesive, or real glue made from raw ingredients that first have to be gathered from the surrounding environment, then carefully processed, and finally combined together in very precise, very specific proportions. That last part, the adhesive itself, is where this story genuinely starts to surprise people, even people who think they already have a good sense of how clever early humans must have been. At Sabutu Cave, in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, an archaeologist named Lynn Wadley found something that fundamentally changed how scientists think about the ancient mind. Stone tools recovered from the site, dating back roughly 70,000 years, showed clear physical traces of a compound adhesive, specifically a glue made by deliberately, intentionally mixing plant gum together with red ochre, and crucially, that ochre was not decorative in any way. It wasn't there for color or symbolism. It was functioning as what chemists would now call a loading agent, mixed carefully into the gum in exactly the right proportion needed to make the finished adhesive stiffer and considerably less brittle under stress. Wadley published her full analysis in the journal PNAS in 2010, and her core argument was striking. Making this particular adhesive was not a product of casual trial and error. It was, functionally speaking, chemistry. Whoever made it had to control fire temperatures precisely while simultaneously preparing multiple separate ingredients, plan the entire process out well in advance, and hold all of it together in working memory across several distinct steps. And remarkably, it wasn't only our own species figuring this out independently. Neanderthals were making adhesives too. And there's real evidence they may have actually been doing it earlier than we were in 2017. A researcher named Paul Kozowick, working with colleagues at Leiden University, published detailed experiments in the journal Scientific Reports. Their findings demonstrated that Neanderthals had produced birch bark tar, widely considered the oldest known synthetic material anywhere in the entire archaeological record. As far back as 200,000 years ago, this tar has been found at sites called Campitello, in Italy, and Königsau, in Germany. And separately, Bruce Hardy, at Kenyon College, published the discovery of 90,000-year-old twisted cordage made deliberately by Neanderthal hands at a site called Abri du Marais in France, back in 2020. By this point in the timeline, all the necessary pieces were clearly in place: the raw materials, the adhesive technology, and the underlying cognitive capacity required to plan and execute a genuinely complex, multi-step manufacturing process. The oldest edge ground stone axes anywhere in the world, meaning real axes with cutting edges deliberately ground smooth, and specifically designed to be hafted onto handles, come from a site called Majbeeb, a rock shelter located in Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory of Australia, and they are 65,000 years old. Chris Clarkson, at the University of Queensland, led the excavation there, with the full findings published in the journal Nature in 2017. His team recovered ground edge hatchet heads sitting in the very deepest occupation layers of the site, layers that represented some of the earliest human presence at that location. These particular axes were not simply chipped roughly into shape the way older tools had been. Their cutting edges were deliberately ground smooth through the patient, repetitive work of rubbing the stone back and forth across a sandstone surface, over and over, until it produced a smooth, beveled edge, one that turns out to be both sharper and considerably more durable than a simply chipped, or napped, edge ever could be. Ground edge axes appeared in Australia roughly 30 to 35,000 years before anything comparable shows up anywhere else on the entire planet. In Europe and across the Near East, similar ground edge technology doesn't appear in the archaeological record until around 10,000 years ago, meaning Aboriginal Australians were already using fully hafted ground edge axes to cut bark, shape other tools, and clear trees a full 65,000 years ago, long before anyone else caught up to that same idea. Now fast forward roughly 55,000 years from that point, Europe and the Near East are finally catching up. During the Neolithic period, spanning roughly 10,000 to 3,000 BCE, polished stone axes became the single defining technology of that entire age. Across northern and central Europe, dense, largely unbroken forest still covered most of the continent, and in order to actually farm that land, human communities needed an axe capable of reliably biting into tough hardwood without shattering apart after only a handful of solid strikes. A well-made polished stone axe, in skilled hands, could fell a tree roughly 30 centimeters in diameter in about 15 to 20 minutes, and production of these tools didn't stay small-scale or purely local. It became, in a very real sense, industrial. The Langdale Axe Factory, located in England's Lake District, operated at elevations reaching up to 800 meters above sea level, and workers there quarried a specific green volcanic tuff from what's known as the Borrowdale Volcanic Group, actively working the site somewhere between 4000 and 2500 BCE. Detailed petrographic analysis has shown that axes produced at Langdale were traded extensively across England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, with some individual axes traveling well over 400 kilometers from where they were originally quarried. Many of these surviving axes show essentially no signs of practical use at all. They weren't tools meant for felling trees. They were prestige objects, status symbols, valuable gifts exchanged specifically to build and cement alliances between distant communities. Similarly, the researcher Pierre Petriquin has documented extraordinarily fine jadeite axes, quarried from Monte Viso, high in the Italian Alps, and then distributed widely across Western Europe through long-distance trade and exchange networks. Meanwhile, palynologists, scientists who specialize in studying ancient pollen, preserved carefully in lake sediments and peat bogs, have documented a genuinely dramatic environmental transformation sweeping across Europe, starting somewhere around 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. Tree pollen, from species like oak, elm, and lime, drops off sharply in the sediment record during this period, while pollen from cereal crops and cultivated grains rises just as sharply in its place. A specific, well-documented event known as the Neolithic elm decline, dated to around 3800 BCE, marks a period of especially widespread, deliberate forest clearance. In other words, Europe's ancient forests were being deliberately cut down by ordinary people holding polished stone axes, specifically to make room for wheat, for barley, and for grazing cattle. Without the axe as a functioning piece of technology, the broader agricultural revolution across temperate Europe would very likely have been dramatically slower, or, in some regions, effectively impossible. In September of 1991, a pair of hikers walking through the Alps stumbled across the frozen, remarkably preserved body of a man who came to be known as Otzi, a man who had been sealed in ice for roughly 5,300 years. Among his carefully preserved possessions was a U-handled axe, fitted with a blade made of 99.7% pure copper, bound securely to its handle with leather strips and birch tar. Otzi's axe represents a genuinely crucial technological turning point. Lead isotope analysis, published by researcher Gilberto Artioli in 2017, was able to trace the specific copper ore used in that blade to a source over 500 kilometers away. In southern Tuscany, smelted copper axes like this one could be resharpened essentially endlessly, simply through careful hammering, and they effectively bridged the enormous technological gap between simple worked stone and true metalworking bronze, meaning copper deliberately alloyed with roughly 10% tin, allowed axe design to evolve even further, moving from simple flat blades into flanged axes, then into palstaves fitted with distinct stop ridges, and eventually into fully socketed axes, where the wooden handle actually fit securely inside a hollow metal head, rather than the head being lashed onto the outside of the handle. When the major Bronze Age trade networks that supplied tin eventually collapsed, somewhere around 1200 BCE, iron gradually replaced bronze as the dominant material of choice, and because usable iron ore happens to be abundant almost everywhere in the world, unlike the specific tin needed for bronze, iron effectively democratized access to the axe as a piece of technology. Suddenly, ordinary people, not just elites with access to rare trade networks, could realistically own a genuinely good axe. This shift helped drive a second great wave of forest clearing and a corresponding boom in shipbuilding throughout medieval Europe. For the Vikings specifically, the axe wasn't just one tool among many, it was the primary tool, and very often the primary weapon, of daily life. The Dane axe featured a notably wide, thin blade, mounted on a long handle roughly 120 to 150 centimeters in length, and it was genuinely capable of splitting straight through an opponent's wooden shield, an image famously depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, in scenes from the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The bearded axe, known in Old Norse as the skeggix, had a distinctive hooked lower edge, specifically shaped to catch and pull down an opponent's shield in close combat, or, just as often, to serve as a perfectly ordinary woodworking tool back at home, splitting timber for a longhouse, or shaping planks for a ship. The same basic object, carried by the same person, doing two completely different jobs depending on the day. And elite ceremonial artifacts, like the so-called mammon axe, draped in intricate, delicate silver wire scrollwork, clearly demonstrate that by this point, axes had become both genuinely deadly weapons, and simultaneously, objects of real artistic craftsmanship, valuable enough to be buried alongside their owners as a mark of status carried into the next life. Beyond its purely practical uses, the axe gradually became something else entirely, a nearly universal symbol of power, authority, and status, showing up again and again across cultures that had no direct contact with one another. In ancient Rome, the fasces was a tightly bound bundle of wooden rods, wrapped around a single axe blade, symbolizing formal judicial and governmental authority. That symbol is, incidentally, the direct linguistic root of our modern word fascism on the island of Crete. The Minoan labrys was a striking double-headed axe, closely associated with Minoan civilization between roughly 2700 and 1450 BCE, and prominently featured throughout their religious art and iconography. That specific symbol, in turn, is widely believed to be the origin of our modern word labyrinth. And in North America, Algonquian stone tomahawks gradually evolved into iron trade axes following contact with European traders, eventually serving as a genuinely essential form of currency throughout the North American fur trade. Step back now, and look at the axe as a whole, complete object. Rather than a simple tool, it's actually a composite technology, made up of several distinct, interdependent parts, a carefully shaped stone or metal head, a purpose-built wooden handle, some form of binding, and in many cases, a deliberately manufactured adhesive. None of these individual components function on their own. Each one only becomes genuinely useful in careful combination with all the others. Researchers studying the cognitive science behind this, people like Miriam Hadel, who developed what are known as cognogram diagrams, along with Thomas Wynne, Frederick Coolidge, and Marlies Lombard have consistently emphasized that hafted axes represent something significant about the ancient mind itself. Substantially enhanced working memory, genuine abstract multi-step planning, and what researchers now describe as true cognitive modernity. Successfully making a fully hafted axe required holding a genuinely complex mental template in mind, often for several days, well before the final assembly ever actually took place. So the next time you pick up something as ordinary as an axe, it's worth remembering what you're actually holding. Not a simple tool, not a single clever idea. From a single clever moment you're holding roughly 1.7 million years of accumulated trial, error, failure, and refinement. You're holding the work of at least 3 separate hominin species, spread across 4 different continents, all slowly, independently, converging on the exact same fundamental solution. A stone had a wooden handle bound tightly together by a mind capable of imagining, in careful detail, a finished tool that didn't exist yet, and then patiently building it into being, piece by piece, exactly as planned. Think back to where this started. A bare fist, a sharp stone, and a tree that simply would not fall. Somewhere between that moment and this one, a whole chain of separate breakthroughs had to happen, in the right order, and none of them were guaranteed. A shape had to be discovered by hand, refined over 1 million years, then finally lifted off the palm and onto a handle. A glue had to be invented, from ochre and gum and careful heat. An edge had to be ground smooth instead of just chipped sharp. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, forests started falling faster than they ever had before, and